So my goal here is to introduce data privacy, GDPR, UX, talk a little bit about the history, where we've been. We've done some pretty extensive research with users and influencers across the US. So I want to talk about where we are today, what's the current state of things from a user standpoint, and also want to talk about what the future might look like. So, and I have a challenge for us at the end about, as professionals in the UX community, what's our role in this and where are we going to go? So I want to start with this question of GDPR and talk about what that is, what is included, how did it get started, and then I want to share with you some of the research that we've done with users and what the current state of things, how users understand this, and we also talked to influencers across the country as well to get their perspective on this. We also did a lot of internal research with our own researchers and specialists at Answer Lab to learn about what their experience has been, and we looked at some of our own internal studies. And we also want to talk about some of the business best practices that are going to be important here. And then again, we want to talk about the future. A little bit about me. I am a principal researcher at Answer Lab. I've been there about 2.5 years, but I have a couple decades of market research and user research prior to that. I was one of the early e-commerce, e-business managers for Hewlett-Packard in the early days of the web. So I was around for some of the early social media, online learning, cloud-based services, before a lot of those terms even existed. And I remember what the world was like before the internet and the web and what marketing was like. And I want to share some of those experiences with you as well. So I've been lucky enough in working with Answer Lab and working with a lot of the other companies that I have over the last 20, 25 years to have experienced some of the best brands and the best companies and the best practices out there. So this has been a real privilege for me to have worked with these companies, and hopefully I can bring some insight to you from some of what I've done and some of the work that Answer Lab is currently involved with. So I want to start with a little bit of history. So this is a realm that GDPR and data privacy and what I'll refer to as behavioral analytics, which is really the nature of what's going on here, the nature of the science that a lot of companies are pursuing that lead to a lot of these data privacy challenges, opportunities, and issues. So in the very early days, there was a guy named Seth Godin, some of whom you may know. In the late 90s, introduced a concept called permission marketing. And there was a pretty elaborate set of science that grew out of this around how to gather user information and how to learn about individuals that may already be your customers or may want to become your customers, and how to use that information to market to them better using this new technology called the internet and the web. That was sort of the early days, and a lot of what we did back then was based on permission. It was based on getting people's consent to get information from them. In many cases, early on, it was only an email address. But we learned a lot about who our customers were, and we began to push content at them, marketing at them, offers at them. That grew through a lot of other efforts, programs, science, and businesses. Like, this is one of my favorites. This is Brian Clark with Copyblogger. Jeff Walker with Product Launch Formula developed a lot of new methods and took this whole permission marketing concept to whole new levels. And that was some of the early days, and those guys are still around, and a lot of what they've done has become a lot more elaborated and a lot more sophisticated. And so now we have companies like Facebook and Google in the content delivery space, and the search space, and the social media space that are gathering vast amounts of information about us and about everybody else and using that, analyzing it both individually and collectively in ways that serve them and hopefully help serve the users that they're learning about as well. So this science, we could spend an entire day, we could spend an entire master's course on the whole nature of permission marketing and behavioral analytics. But that's not my goal here. My goal is to just introduce enough of this to set the tone or provide a context for what's going on here and how we do this. So what is GDPR? How many of you have even a passing understanding of GDPR? How many of you have done any serious delving into it in any kind of detail? How many of you are really not at all sure what this is about and you're here to hopefully learn a little bit about it? Okay, good. Well, everybody in the room has got some understanding of it. So, of course, it stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, and it started in the EU, was launched a little over a year ago in May of 2018. There's a lot of good information online about it, and some of you may have already, gone to some of these resources and learned a lot about this. If you haven't, I encourage you to do that. There are a few key components of GDPR that I want to talk about, and we'll touch on some of these in detail, and some of them we won't have time for. So there are actually 9 of them, and let me just touch on them quickly. So the first one is consent, and what this says is that companies are going to ask us for permission to gather information about us and then do something with that information. The regulation says that we have to participate in that, and we have to consent to whatever those companies are doing with our own personal data. It says that as users, we have a right to access that information. We have a right to see what it is and understand what's contained in it and what companies might be doing with it. So there's a visibility, or we have the right to see what's going on. We also have the right to opt out. We have the right to say no. I want you to delete whatever you have about me, I want you to forget who I am, and I want you to stop this practice. And that's a real challenge for some companies because of the complexity of what they've done and because of the number of legacy systems that they may have out there. It also talks about data portability, which basically says that I have the ability to take this data set that is mine and be able to download it and really analyze it in detail. Now, this again has been a challenge for a lot of companies and for a lot of users, because even if companies can provide this, as a user, most users are not sophisticated enough to really get into this data and really understand what it's about, how it's acquired, how it's used. So this is a very challenging area for many dimensions. It incorporates this whole realm of design principles called privacy by design. And some of you are probably aware of this. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about this. This is a very critical aspect for our professional community when it comes to dealing with data privacy and GDPR specifically. GDPR talks about a specific territorial scope, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. There are some new dimensions that are coming out in that realm that we all need to be aware of. It also dictates the fact that companies need to have specific professionals dedicated to this. There need to be people who have accountability for this within companies that are collecting personal data. And those people's, and the exact accountability that those people have should be spelled out and managed very specifically. Also, breach notification. If something happens, if somebody hacks into my system as a company, I have to notify my users about that. And some companies have been very proactive about that, other companies have not been. There's some companies have taken a very long time to reveal that anything happened at all or what the extent of what has happened. So that's a new one for companies as well that they're just working on. And then finally, of course, there are penalties. And we've probably all heard about some of the massive fines that, for example, Google has recently faced from the EU as a result of some of their practices. And you can expect that there are a lot more coming, and some of them are going to be very large on the magnitude of what Google has endured, or maybe even larger. So the 3 that we are probably most concerned with as UX professionals are consent, right to access, and privacy by design, because this is what we're going to be most involved with in helping users get access to their data, understand it, consent to it, help them do a lot of the other things that you see here. So these are some of the ones that I'm going to focus on here today. So let's talk about GDPR. So how did it come about? What's it about? Again, some of this, for those of you that have delved into this, is probably going to be reasonably familiar. So GDPR arises as a result of issues that come out of the use of personal data, our customers' personal data, what our companies that we work for may be doing, what our clients may be doing. Of course, those data privacy issues are driven by this really complex, capable, and elaborate new science, it's actually not so new anymore, about data-driven behavioral predictive analytics. So we can now collect a lot of information about our users, analyze it, and apply it in ways that we could never before. Back in the days before the internet, when I worked for Hewlett-Packard, we did a lot of marketing without this kind of science. And the joke back then was, I know I'm wasting half of my marketing budget, I just don't know which half. That's not a problem anymore, because now we know exactly where our marketing budget is going, we know exactly where our investment's going, we know exactly what return we're getting out of that. The capability of this science is really dramatic, and it's just going to continue to accelerate. And so this really gets to what Lisa talked about this morning. Because there's so much capability here, because the science is so elaborate, and when we bring in artificial intelligence and we bring in these algorithms, we can do dramatic things. And now that brings up the need for governance, it brings up the need for oversight, and it brings up a lot of the issues that she brought up this morning. So I think her discussion about governance is very relevant to what we're talking about here with data privacy. So one of the questions that come up is, okay, so if data privacy is an EU initiative, what does it have to do with the US? So how many of you are US based? How many of you are European? Other parts of the world besides US and Europe? Okay, we got one person. So there's that, this is an international audience. I think you heard this morning, I don't know how many countries are represented here, but a lot of companies that do business on the internet don't make a distinction. They don't sort by IP address. They may do business in Europe. European customers may choose to do business with US customers. The other thing that's happening is that this is no longer just a European regulation. There are a lot of other countries and US states that are now starting to implement similar kinds of regulations. In fact, for a while, it's going to be a patchwork of stuff. Going to be challenges for companies to keep track of all these regulations and know which ones they need to follow, what the penalties are. So this gets a lot more complex. Also, what does GDPR have to do with UX? That's one of the key questions I want to answer here. And so I want to share with you some of our discoveries and some of our positions within Answer Lab about what we think the connection here is. I think it's a very strong connection. So, for example, the goals and the intentions of behavioral analytics and user experience are very much aligned. There's a lot of overlap between what we're trying to accomplish with a lot of the traditional user experience and with behavioral analytics. So going back to my diagram, so there's GDPR, we have these data privacy issues that drive that. Of course, all of that then is an outgrowth of all of these behavioral analytics and all this science that we're putting behind all this privacy information that we have. And ultimately, all of that is designed, of course, to influence users. It's designed to get users, because they see things that are familiar to them or that fit their needs or their interests or whatever, they're more likely to take some action in favor of whatever our business goals might be. And of course, then, what's the goal of user experience? Also to influence users. So what we're all trying to accomplish here is very much overlap. You cannot separate these. And again, governance now is going to influence all of this. So because those can't be separated, because the purposes and the intentions of data privacy and user experience are so closely intertwined, the governance that's now being imposed on this is going to influence everything that we do as UX professionals. So the second one that grows directly out of this is, now that these are so closely intertwined, users experience both. When someone uses an app or a website or an interactive something, they're going to be encountering the traditional qualitative user experience, as well as they're going to be exposed to all these behavioral analytics based on the data that the companies have about them, again, individually, collectively. So when somebody goes to one of these very familiar websites, what's going on to one degree or another on all of these websites and all of these experiences, of course, are the traditional usability, user experience, things that we do as user experience professionals, plus there's a tremendous amount of intelligence and personal data being gathered and applied behind all of this based on the offers people see, based on their order history, based on customer service. There's just so much that goes on here that can't be separated. So that's one of the key reasons that UX, GDPR, data privacy are so related, is because they're all related right here in all these experiences. Also, we're in a unique position because we can see so clearly and so vividly how those are closely intertwined. We have an opportunity to guide compliance. So those 9 aspects of GDPR that I listed, we're in a unique position to understand those, to apply those, to evaluate those, validate those, do whatever we need to do for our own companies, for our clients, or whoever. So as professionals, we have a responsibility to be involved in guiding what happens with this. And that's something that AnswerLab is very much involved with, is helping companies understand this, helping them make the right choices about compliance. And from a very specific, detailed level, we also are going to influence and drive the specific user experience that allows users to do all those things that GDPR requires, to consent, to make choices about my data, to be able to download it, to be able to go into whatever app or website and set up my controls and do whatever I need to do. So we're very much involved in this process, and that's why we can't separate these. I would also say we're in a position to take more leadership, and I think Lisa touched on some of these this morning as well. And I think we can step up as professionals, and we can begin to understand this world, we can begin to understand these dynamics and help decision makers do the right thing, because this is not going to get any easier, it's not going to get any simpler, it's not going to get any less regulated. There are a lot of things that are going to be happening in the very near future that's going to put us in a position where we can really influence where all this goes. And we should, this is important. And again, it's really about doing the right thing. As researchers, as designers, that's what we're about. You know, as researchers, we're out there to understand objectively what is true, what is real, what is important. And so we have an opportunity to help people make the right decisions. And you can make a case that sometimes the right decisions have not been made. And now we have an opportunity to get better at this. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the current state of things. So that's GDPR. That's why GDPR and user experience are so closely related and really can't be separated. Let's talk about some of the things that we've learned from users around the country. So we did an initial study a year ago when GDPR first came out, and this was intended to just sort of take a pulse of users and what they understood about this, how they were dealing with data privacy. What we learned is that, not surprisingly, users fall into three categories. There are those users that really have no clue about this. They don't really understand what companies are doing. They don't understand that they have any control over this, and they don't understand the business reasons for it. There's sort of a middle group that have some sense of what's going on, that maybe have tried to learn a little more about it, or maybe even make some influence on what their data privacy settings are, but they haven't really figured it out. They haven't really gone very far. And then there's a much smaller group of savvy users who have taken the time to learn this and really figure it out. That is by far the smallest group. That top group is maybe at most 10%. Yes?
I'm sorry, maybe you already said this. Did you survey people about their knowledge about GDPR or about data collection practices?
Both. So it was really to understand as GDPR was rolling out. Now, bottom line is hardly anybody has heard the term GDPR in the general population. So most of that conversation was about data privacy and about business practices that companies are doing with their data. And as a result of that phase 1 study, I think we did about 25 users around the country. It was really focused on individual users, and we came up with a set of recommendations for companies on what they should pay attention to at the dawn of GDPR. And the main one here is, again, whatever you do, make sure you do a lot of testing. That's what a lot of this community is about, and that was one of the main outcomes of that first study. And you can go to our website. There's a very detailed paper there on what we learned from that first phase. We also went into a lot more detail on each of these three categories of users and what they learned and what their preferences were. So we encourage you to go there and check that out. There's a lot there to learn about that. We decided to do another phase and go deeper. And we went deeper on data privacy with another set of users. We also talked, this time we expanded the net and talked to influencers around the country, people who are in this space, who are professionals, who have some knowledge of what's going on here. We also did a lot more looking at our own internal studies and talking to our own researchers and strategists and really learning, what other discoveries we'd made about this and working with our clients. And then there was a pretty significant secondary research component to this as well. And so here are some of the findings, major findings that came out of this second round. And I think the second round, because we did a much broader scope of research around this, I think we made a lot more discoveries about what's really happening. But again, it almost feels like we're still kind of scratching the surface. There's still so much more to learn about this. But let me share what some of the major things were. As I mentioned, almost no average users really understand or have even heard of GDPR, and very few of them are knowledgeable about privacy in general. That was not a big surprise because that was consistent with what we uncovered in the first one. And for example, looking at one of our own internal studies where we were just looking at online skills in general without really specifically focusing on privacy, privacy came up over and over again, even though that was not the focus of the study. People's ability to figure it out, their confidence in it, their knowing where to go, how to get started. This was just one that they were just really befuddled about. So this, our own research that we've done independent of this revealed what was going on. Another key finding is the gap is widening. Users in general have a certain amount of fatigue about this. For a long time, when GDPR came out, people kept getting flashed, here's our new terms and conditions, please read these and agree to them, and now it's all the cookie messages everybody's getting. And most people just click through them, will you quit showing me these? And the other thing that's happening here is that as user fatigue grows, the sophistication and complexity of what companies can do, the artificial intelligence that can be applied and the algorithms that are available to do this become more and more complex. And that's really what's driving the gap. The acceleration of the science is far exceeding users' ability to understand it and really know what's going on here. And why? Because in a lot of cases, users don't see any value. This was, to me, one of the biggest insights was that even the people that knew this was going on or know this is happening with their data and have some understanding of it could identify very few examples where they felt like it really had any benefit to them. They felt like this was all for the benefit of the companies that were gathering this data. They don't see anything here that they personally can benefit from. And then, a lot of them just purely opt out. So you get this kind of situation where, clearly somebody forgot to opt into notifications. And people miss out on things. They decide not to participate in some aspects of this just out of fear and suspicion, not because they're making conscious choices about what they really want to learn or what information they want pushed at them. Another really interesting discovery is there's, again, a huge disparity of how effective behavioral analytics are. We hear examples of people that say, one anecdote is, I was on the subway and I was having a conversation about something with my friend. And later that day, I saw an ad online for that. So they must be listening to me through my phone. That's the only way. Well, what's really going on there is that the data model for that individual is so sophisticated that whatever they're interested in, they're having conversations about, and companies also know about that, and they're showing them offers or ads for that as well. The other end of the spectrum is I've never seen anything relevant about me at all. So the ways that we use and apply this science is very fragmented and very spread around. So there's a big gap here as well. Another interesting one is that the more savvy users, and there are not very many of them, the more savvy users don't necessarily rely on their controls. They rely on their own behavior. They make choices about what they do online that's going to control what companies know about them, how much of their own information they're going to reveal, how much risk they might take, et cetera. And companies now are getting a lot more sophisticated about this as well. So how many of you now have new guidelines? They may not be so new. How many of you have guidelines at your jobs about what you can click on and what kind of information you're allowed to share and all that? How many of you have changed your own personal behaviors to protect yourself and avoid, so people are figuring out that the way to do this isn't necessarily through the controls that companies give me. I have to make my own conscious, intelligent choices about how to do this. So here's one example. A guy we talked to, he's a Yelp power user, lives in New York City, spends a lot of time at restaurants, has a lot of followers, and he's very wary of being stalked. He's heard some bad experiences about this, so he never checks in about a restaurant until after he's left the restaurant. And then he'll post everything. He'll act like he's at the restaurant when he posts, but he'll wait till he physically leaves. And he keeps his posts vague. He doesn't provide a lot of specifics about himself or where he's been or where he's going. So he's very involved in the whole Yelp community, and he's a real foodie and all this, but he's very cautious about what he actually posts online. And he keeps it anonymous. He tries to keep very specific things about himself out of the picture. So again, here's an example of somebody who's moderating their behavior, even though Yelp's very important to him and what he posts is part of who he's, what he's about, but he's very selective about what he does. Okay, so some other observations from that second phase study. As I mentioned, changes are coming. So this is not just a European initiative. There's a new initiative being launched in California. There's another one being introduced in Utah, and these are inconsistent. Some of them are focused on different aspects of data privacy and GDPR. So it's going to be challenging for companies to keep track of this and really understand what's going on and what they need to follow. Another really important one is that best practices around GDPR and data privacy, while they have many best practices on implementing the right types of user experiences, ultimately they start in the operation. And I'll touch on some of these at the end because they're really important from a business standpoint. And of course, now we're in this mode where the data becomes more valuable than the product. And people now, because they're tied to the data, they're what produce the data, then they actually become the product. And you know, a classic example is one product worth $100 is not worth nearly as much as an algorithm based on 1 million interactions with that product that can drive significant amounts of revenue because the companies have modeled what people actually do with that product. So that the world has changed. It's a very different place now based on simple formulas like this. And as I mentioned, overlapping intent. What we're trying to accomplish with traditional UX is inseparable from what behavioral analytics are attempting to do with users as well. And that's a pretty key discovery. So we talked about that one. A lot of people are working on changing their own behavior. I want to get into some more specifics on users and how they react. So general attitudes around this, based on these studies that we've done, in general, again, there's a lot of fatigue. There's a lot of, I'm really busy. I don't really have time to figure this out. It's really complicated. You know, every interface is different. And a lot of responses from people is, I'm overwhelmed. I can't deal with this. This is just too much. I'm just going to keep my fingers crossed and hope companies make the right decisions. There's this sort of resignation. Well, cat's out of the bag, and that ship has sailed. It's just the nature of the world. We're just going to have to get used to it. If we want to be online, if we want to do business with these companies, this is just the way it's going to be. And it's sort of the sense of resignation. People have just come to accept it. Interestingly, some of the anecdotes I've heard from other parts of the world don't necessarily reflect this. In some of the studies I've looked at from Europeans, they're a little more engaged. They don't necessarily have the same degree of resignation that the U.S. population seems to. There's this sense of, or lack of control. So even if I make the right choices, I'm not confident that they're going to stick. I'm not confident that they're going to be secure. I'm not confident that eventually I'm going to have to go back and do them again because the regulation's going to change or the company's going to change. So there's a lot of concern about whether I really have a choice in all of this. And trust is a big one. That's another one that comes up a lot as well. So these are just some of the attitudes that we hear from users when we go out and talk to the general population about data privacy and what their experience is with it and what they think they can do about it. So users, in addition to some of those comments around trust and acceptance and just general attitudes, there's a lot of dimensions, a lot of layers of what users have to do in this space here. And these aren't all that different than what users have to do with a lot of other types of interactive systems. So, are they aware? Or do they care? Do they make any attempt to understand this and find it and do anything with it? Do they actually locate where the controls are? Do they notice what's important, and are they able to, figure out how to make this work? Do they understand what all the consequences are of making these choices? Do they act? Do they feel like they're successful? Do they trust what happened? Are they able to reflect on what's going on and what impact this has on them as online citizens? And so at any one of these, somebody might get hung up or stuck. At any company, any one of these, any people might get hung up or stuck. So this is a complicated issue. And again, this kind of relates to user experience in general, but it's especially relevant with data privacy controls and what users are attempting to do here. So when you talk to users and you ask them, okay, so, and in some cases, when I've interviewed these people, I've actually had to explain to them how this works. Do you know companies gather information about you? And do you know that they analyze it and they use it to present content and offers and marketing and whatever? There's all sorts of things that they do to influence what you encounter online. And some people are like, really? That's it. And then you sort of remind them of, of specific anecdotal things like, oh yeah, I remember that happening. So even when you talk to them, some of them don't understand this at all, and I'm sort of enlightening them to this. And some of them, again, kind of have a vague sense that this is going on, and some of them understand it a lot more thoroughly. But when you say, so what? What benefit do you think this has? What do you expect you get out of this? You hear things like, well, I guess I can keep track of where I've been. I get some record of my behavior online myself. I probably can meet new people that are probably like-minded, maybe. I can do that, and of course that's very much about social media. I can probably see information about products or services that I'm interested in that maybe are more relevant. I guess that's probably one that would be useful. I can probably maybe get better customer service because companies know more about me and what I've purchased and what my preferences are. Maybe I can learn, have some long history of my life events and, have some, and again, this is more social media related. I can have news or articles or content or whatever offered to me that are more tailored to my interests or my work or whatever I happen to be about. And again, that's about interests. And maybe I can get marketing offers or other things that might be relevant to me. So the interesting thing about this, though, is when you have this conversation with them, most of these are theoretical. They're just kind of speculating on what they think might be useful. They actually don't realize, they don't see much of this actually going on. They see maybe little snippets of it, but most of them are sort of imagining what this could be. So the challenge then is, are there ways for us as professionals to do this better? Clearly, companies see benefits in behavioral analytics and gathering all this data. Are there ways as user experience professionals that we can influence this that are more value to the users themselves? Because I would propose that if we don't, then we're going to continue to lose them. They're going to get less and less interested, less and less willing, and that's going to create risk for us as companies and businesses, and therefore risk for us as professionals. Okay, any questions up to this point about GDPR? What's it about? What are user reactions and beliefs about this? I want to get into some best practices that we discovered. Yes?
I just wanted to ask to clarify, the studies you were talking about in the beginning, was that with the US-based population?
Yes, yes, good question. So those were focused on the US, and we've got some anecdotal stuff about some of our own studies that we've done in other parts of the world, but those focused ones were specifically US.
Okay, yeah, that makes, because I was wondering, I've heard a lot from people in Europe, and they're much more tuned into the GDPR and privacy controls. Okay.
It's interesting, though, and again, this is probably another whole talk, but in some of the anecdotal stuff I've heard from Europe and other places, there are cultural elements that come into data privacy. Mm-hmm. Some of the history of some of the European countries and other countries, there are attitudes and belief systems around personal privacy that actually are very different than the US. That we may not have some of those historical aspects that some of those other cultures do, which has a big impact. So, we're going to continue this research and expanding it to some of those other countries and cultures is probably an important aspect of this. Okay, other?
I guess also related to methodology, I didn't see what age ranges you talked to. Maybe that was on one of the slides. But I was wondering if you saw much of a difference between generational cohorts in terms of their attitudes toward data privacy.
Yeah, so we did not specifically profile or recruit by age, but we had a pretty broad range, and there definitely was an age factor. Older people tended to be less aware of this. Also, older people tended to confuse data privacy and behavioral analytics with hacking and identity theft and some of the other sort of more nefarious illegal things that go on. And in some cases, I had a really hard time separating that. In their minds, it was all rolled up into one. They just couldn't see the difference. And therefore, some of the older people just stay away from things online entirely because they're afraid of identity theft and data breaches and things like that. So so the age dimension is another one we probably want to look into further.
Was there any research on people who would be using some kind of a portal to erase the data and portability?
We did not specifically take each one of those GDPR requirements and try to break them down. We did talk more about data privacy controls, and I'm going to talk about some best practices around that. But data portability is one that we have not touched on yet, and I know from some of the secondary research that's a real challenge for some people. Users, and it's a real challenge for some companies as well to do that well.
Yeah, we're currently trying to create a portal for the, I guess, HR admins to access the data for their users, and then they can erase or they can use the portability feature. And what's scary about the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, is they're not educated, which is quite scary because they're half of the year, and I think in next year it will be activated. So I was kind of curious from that perspective, but thank you so much.
Yeah, actually that's another one. I wish we had more time to talk about that. Whole data portability issue is one that, there are some companies that are really in a bind on this one because they've been gathering customer data for decades, and they've got legacy systems, and they don't even know where their data is. And they may have partners that have done stuff with their data, and it's just, as soon as you say, I've got to give that user a data set and help them understand it, and the cost of re-engineering that could be actually be an existential threat because it's a massive problem. So again, that's a whole other talk, but that's a big deal. Yeah.
So first I'd like to say, even though you're the last one of the day, this is by far the best presentation that I've seen so far. So
thank
good
you.
job.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Also, this is very pertinent to me. I work for Integrate, which is in Phoenix. It's a startup for marketing tech. So GDPR is a big deal. We just acquired a company in Europe to help deal with this problem. But there's like two big problems that I see. It's an education thing, right? People don't know what this is or how it's happening. And it's like, once you understand it, and it's like, yeah, how many things have I bought off Instagram that I was like, that's perfect. That's exactly what I want. But then there's also, it's like, when it comes to, medical stuff or something, when it gets into the hands of a company that you don't trust, that's where we need controls. Is like, I want to share my data, but not with these companies.
Right.
And that's going to be a big turning point in the ethics of companies, hopefully.
Yes, and I think Lisa touched on a lot of that this morning as well. That's what she's talking about. I mean, she didn't specifically talk about data privacy, but this whole governance thing it's a free-for-all, and we do it because we can. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing, or that it works for people, or that it's safe, or that it's private. And that's why that's why these regulations are coming into play. Good questions. Thank you. Okay, let's talk about some best practices. We're going to focus mostly on user experience, and then I have a few final business ones to talk about as well. So, at a higher level, it's important to understand your users. We do this kind of thing all the time. We create personas, we create journey maps. Understanding who your users are, because there's no one answer to this. And your users, your audience, your business, your products are going to be different than the person sitting next to you. So it's really important that you figure out what that map looks like. And I can't give you that answer. You've got to answer that yourself. You've got to look at it from an omni-channel standpoint. This isn't just online, because you're collecting data in your call center, you're collecting data from your salespeople, you're collecting data from your printed stuff. It's all over the place, okay? You can't leave any of these out, because the regulation isn't going to leave any of these out. You don't get a pass on any of the touch points in your whole omni-channel universe. You got to figure all this out. And again, you can't separate traditional user experience from that behavioral analytics aspect of it. It's all rolled into one. As again, I showed these, Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, the big extreme examples, but it's all woven together. You can't separate them. You got to look at it holistically because they all are affected. And then, so the other thing I would encourage you to do too, once you've got all that mapped out and understood that, you really need to look at GDPR. And we've had a few questions in here about that. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you have to ask yourself these questions about consent and about right to access, because these are how you're going to be held accountable. You have to ask your question, or do you want to get a picture of that? Sorry.
They're recording them anyway.
And then you have to ask questions about, again, right to be forgotten. How do you allow users to do that? Do you allow users to do that? What about data portability? We had a question just a minute ago about that. How do you know where your data is? Can you show it to users? Can they understand it? And then, whoops, my clicker's not being very cooperative. So then privacy by design, is the big one. And this is probably one of the biggest takeaways here that I want to leave with you. And again, you could teach a whole course on this, and there are courses on this. Privacy by design is a key part of GDPR, and it's one as professionals that we need to understand. So I'm going to touch on these principles briefly, and I encourage you to go and do more research on these because these are really important. So first of all, it has to be proactive. You hear lots of examples about companies who close the barn door after the horse got out. Well, that's not acceptable. You got to anticipate what issues or problems you're going to anticipate based on your business and your users and the data that you collect, and you've got to prevent it ahead of time. Fixing the problem after the problem has occurred is not acceptable. That's a really key aspect of privacy by design. Privacy is the default, okay? So what that means is you don't wait till somebody opts in or opts out. You don't wait till the user makes a choice. You assume that privacy is what you're going to do for your users. And then they can go make changes if they want to, but you have to start with privacy as the default. It's embedded into the design. So if you're starting a new design of an app or a website or an e-commerce system or whatever it might be, you have to build into privacy principles from the beginning. Again, from a legacy standpoint, if you've got existing apps, existing websites, existing legacy systems, that one's tough because now you got to go back and redesign them. And that means that could potentially mean a lot of rework. Full functionality, and they put this in there because companies try to make these artificial trade-offs between privacy and ease of use. Well, if we do privacy, people can understand it, and well, that's true, that's a big problem, but you got to figure it out. You can't choose one over the other. You can't choose a business outcome and sacrifice privacy in the process. It's not a zero-sum game. You've got to do it all. And the regulation specifically states this. Visibility, transparency, this is a big one. Probably the simplest way to sum this up is you have to allow independent verification, okay? You've got to be willing to have somebody else come in and evaluate this and say you're meeting the requirement. You can't do it internally. And that's, as researchers that we know all about that. That's pretty important. End-to-end security, full life cycle. So I talked about Omnichannel. You got to make sure all your touch points are covered. You got to make sure your whole life cycle is covered as well. There's a time element here from your first contact with customers until, when? What's the end of the game? Do we even know what that is? That's a tough question. So the life cycle is a really important part of this as well. And again, always keep it user-centric. There's always this huge tendency to want to put the business goals and the KPIs first, but users have to be number one. And so this set of principles is one of the key takeaways from the standpoint of user experience, data privacy, GDPR. So this is one, if you're not familiar with this or if you need to learn more about it, I encourage you to go to do more research on this. It's really, really critical to this whole world. Let's talk about some specific examples. And these are some of the ones that we uncovered and we actually tested in talking to these users. So, and again, none of these are going to be new. If you're a user experience professional, a designer, researcher, developer, whatever, none of these are new. But some of these are very specific examples within data privacy. Well, don't overwhelm. So, look at how many choices as a user I have to figure out here. This is Amazon's example. But there's just, you look at all the things that Amazon does, their whole experience is just People just couldn't figure it out. Another Amazon example, when we went in there, we couldn't actually find where to do it. So the entry point wasn't clear. And actually, early in the study, people were finding it and then they changed something. And when I went in there to create the slide, I couldn't find it anymore. I don't even know where it is. So if I can't even get through the door, it makes it harder for me to set up my own data privacy controls. So where you put the controls is important. Again, another simple UX example. Here, this is a Google, and here they've got images and some nice text and descriptions, and then the toggles are over here on the right. And of course, people's eyes go left and down, so people didn't notice the toggles. So you have to embed the controls in the flow. You have to be smart about where you put them because people may miss them. Layering options, this is actually a good example here of where you've got a menu of account settings, and then you've got some descriptions, and then the selections are then a subcategory under those. And the language is fairly simple, and so this is an example of just keeping things layered in a way that, again, you're chunking the information to create an experience that people can navigate and find their way through. Here's an example. This one is just a Yelp example, where over here, if you make these choices, it gives you some examples of what actually happens. I get to see the result of what I do when I make this selection or not. Common language is another one. So these are a couple of examples this is a mobile one, this is a desktop website. And the questions are phrased in such a way that an average person can understand them. It's not legalese, not a lot of jargon, not a lot of technical details. So most people can get in here and they can read this and they can kind of get a sense of what does this actually mean if I choose this or not. So sorry about my clicker. So here's an example of using colors and visual cues. Just again, to make it a little easier on the eye. So again, it's chunked nicely. There are some icons that relate to each one. They've separated them by color. This is actually a Facebook example. And then again, the language, it's layered in such a way that the titles are fairly clear, the descriptions are short and clear. So again, when we had people go through this kind of interface, they were pretty clear on what these meant and what impact they would have should they make some of these selections. And there are a lot more. So if you study data privacy, and what I've broken these into now here are two different categories, what I call meta approaches. And so for example, teaching people about this. So some of the things that users asked for were, gee, can I just have some video examples? Can you show me a short video of what happens if I do this? So helping educate people and having an FAQ or just some basic information, because most people really struggle with a lot of what this is about. We saw some examples where we went into, data privacy statements that were 7, 8 years old. I mean, go in there and change a word and update the date. I mean, how much confidence do you give people if your data privacy policy is 2011? People are just going to go, am I supposed to trust this? And again, a lot of these core user experience principles are ones that we're all familiar with. And there's specific implementation about how they should be implemented in providing these kinds of controls. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the business side before I finish. So if you're embedded in a company, for your company, if you serve clients, if you're an independent consultant, whatever you are, there's a whole variety of reasons why all this makes sense. So stay out of trouble. Okay, you don't want the fines that can result in, and we look at, Google is a huge universe, so the size of their fines are probably not going to be like what most companies might endure, but policy and governing agencies and governments are getting serious about this. They are imposing fines and they're going to do more and more of this, and you just don't want to go there. Obviously, you want to retain customers. So customers are starting to pay more attention to this, starting to get more savvy about this. They still have a long way to go, but this is going to continue to evolve. And if you do this well, you have a much better chance of doing business where you need to do business. There's overall customer satisfaction issues. So, you know, if people get confused or if they get stuck, you're going to get phone calls, you're going to get emails, people are just going to leave, you're going to run into frustrations, you're just going to make people unhappy, and that's not good for business. And, you know, this science is very powerful. Behavioral analytics really can work, and there are lots of examples where it does. And this is a business opportunity, and if you do it well, then you reap the benefits of that. If you don't do it well, then, you know, lots of other things you might miss out. Pick up the news any given day, and there are all sorts of examples of companies that have bad PR because of choices. And I won't name any names, but we see them all the time, and that's, you know, there are specific big stories that you read about companies that have problems, and there are a variety of them out there. But it could be as simple as just customer reviews. So much now is based on, you know, if I want to buy your product, I want to read your reviews about your product or your company. And if I have bad reviews because I'm not treating my customers well for whatever reason, that's going to have an impact on business. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, it's just doing the right thing. That's, as professionals in this community, that's what we're about. And that alone should be our willingness to serve users and do the right thing should be a really key part of this. So a few other business points to make. As I mentioned, best practice start in the operation. And so, for example, there's a whole science business industry around assessment. And that's way beyond the scope of what I'm here to do, but it's available. And if you haven't done one of these, your company should seriously consider it because you may uncover things that could be really critical for your business. So go check this out. There's a lot of information out there about DPIA, and it might be one that your company, or maybe you recommend to clients as well. Knowing your business and your business model is important. You know, if you're running a small business and all you're really doing is blogging and writing a newsletter and you're collecting information about, that's one thing. If you're creating a massive data analytics platform that you're using in social media and that's what your business is based on, you have a whole different set of problems. So understanding the scope of this is really important. And again, as we all do, everything, test, validate, iterate, put it out in front of real users like we did, really understand your audience, make sure that they know what's going on and that they can validate everything you're doing for GDPR and data privacy. More questions? Yes.
This was great. Thank you. So confidentiality is kind of baked into research anyway,
Yes.
hopefully, in all,
Yes.
in all cases. Have you seen or anticipate any changes in the way that maybe that confidentiality is explained, maybe should be explained to participants or handled with GDPR?
Yeah, that's a good question. I couldn't uncover one. In fact, at one point I actually, and I mentioned to someone earlier that there's so much here, I had a hard time getting this all down into an hour. It's a vast realm. And one of the areas I was considering including was this on research and how we always tell people, you know, I'm going to record this, but I'm only going to use it for research purposes and, you know, confidentiality, et cetera. And I've never seen or experienced any issues around that in all the years. Now, I occasionally have users, you know, I was doing a study for a financial company, I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago, and we had a user that came on, and at the last minute she decided not to do the session because she said, you know, I'm just not comfortable with this, I don't know who you guys are. And I said, that's fine, I totally understand, and we just let her go, and we respect that. And that's what we do, though. You know, if anybody has any issues or concerns about it, we just let them opt out. And we don't ever use data, and I've never heard of any research data being used for inappropriate purposes. So I think we're actually in good shape. I don't know of any specific issues that we need to follow around that. Let's just keep doing the right thing, and I think in a lot of cases we do better than a lot of other disciplines. So I think we're good. But good question.
So when you, I can't hear myself. When you explain to people about the information that was being collected on them or the purposes it was being used for, did you find that their kind of overall mood changed, or did they just kind of not react?
It was a variety of reactions. You know, some people really still had a hard time wrapping their head around it, first of all. There's a few of people like that. There's a few people that were a little shocked and kind of a little creeped out. And then there were some people that were like, oh, yeah, I guess I get that. That's all. I understand why that's good for business. So there were some people that could appreciate that that's a business practice that would be useful to companies. And so there was a pretty good spectrum of reactions to that.
And so the ones that got kind of creeped out, did that impact the rest of your time with them, like in any way that was discernible?
You know, I kept these sessions fairly loose. They weren't real scripted. So I would just kind of follow that rabbit trail with them. So we'd have a conversation about, what experiences did they have, and why did they think companies did this, and would they do anything different now that they knew this, et cetera. So I kind of, again, I didn't have a real solid, I was really trying to have that interaction with them and really understand their narrative when we did this. So yeah, I just tried to follow where they were and where their heads were at.
I'm wondering, in terms of the range of people that you talked with, did any of them kind of react and say, I'm immediately going to make a data access request? Were any of them just, super fired up about it and, or?
Yeah, we did. Especially since we went in some of these examples I showed you, we had them go into some cases. The recruit was their willingness to log on to some of their own accounts. And then I had some sample accounts that I had as well, if they didn't have any or they weren't comfortable doing that. And so a lot of them, when we got in, they were like, oh, okay, I'm going to pay more attention to this. This is really interesting. I didn't know I could do this. Okay, so that was very much an enlightening experience for them to find out that they could do this and they had some control. And I think they were more willing to try it in most cases.
What were your sample sizes for these two studies?
So both sample sizes were in the range of, so the question was sample sizes for the two studies. Both studies were in the range of 20 to 25 users each. So a total of about 45 to 50 users, somewhere in that range so far. And then a handful, and then the second round there was a handful of influencers that we talked to as well to get some of their perspectives. And then again, we did a lot of surveying of some of our own internal strategists and researchers at Answer Lab. And so there was a lot, in the second round there was more than just the end users. Anybody else?
Well, thank you for the insightful talk. I really liked it.
Thank you.
At one point, you had mentioned that users feel overwhelmed, and at some point they say, well, I hope the company is doing the right thing. And I was wondering if you had any information in terms of if there's a potential mismatch, so what the company thinks they are supposed to do because they're thinking about it from a GDPR perspective versus like expectations of what users expect of the companies or the extent in which they expect companies to do for them. So like within that space, if there's any, is there a mismatch or any information?
Yeah, the three areas that we generally focused on were social media, just general retail commerce, kind of buying products, and then financial and retail. And what we found was that the controls and what companies expect them to do, not surprisingly, is far more complex with social media. So the number of things, just the number of ways that the big social media companies gather information and the ways they do it, how much that has changed. So we had some people that would get into some of the social media sites and go, I was in here a year ago, this looks totally different, okay? And of course, some of that's driven by GDPR. Some of those companies are changing those interfaces because of the regulation. And so the social media was the big one. And then most of the e-commerce stuff was pretty simple because most e-commerce companies actually don't provide you that many controls, if any. And then surprisingly, the one that actually people had the most confidence in was finance and banking, which I thought was a bit of a surprise. I thought they would be second on the list, but they were actually, people had more confidence in them.
What did you think would be first?
Well, I expect people would have the least confidence in social media, and then next would be finance and banking, and I thought they would have the most confidence in retail. But I think some of it's, again, there have been some big data breaches in retail lately, so I'm sure that colored their reactions to that. And the other thing I'll finish with is that the future is going to get very, very complicated, okay? Artificial intelligence is going to bring into our lives, and already is, ways that intelligent devices are going to anticipate who we are and learn about us in ways that we can't even imagine now. And it's actually kind of scary and creepy, but it's coming. And it's important as user experience professionals that we learn about this and we be able to drive where this goes, because it's just going to get more complex. And again, I think we're in a unique position to influence this and help drive it in the right direction.